Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here in the program, the workshop on the Unified Airspace Management and Allied Technologies organized by CSIR NAL at another CSIR lab in PEL. And I'm happy to come over to Delhi to find it's being inaugurated with the participation of people from different domains. Thank you all the distinguished guests on the dais, off the dais, and all the participants who are here as well as listening online. I think we are at the right time to start such a discussion. I believe that this is a process that will continue for some more time. How this will be really going to be implemented, transforming this sector over a period of time. And it's very important for a country like India to take initiative at this moment. To talk about a unified airspace, integrating various platforms specific to this nation and possibly at a later point that can be adapted across the world. And this is something which you need to look at it, and if we are at the right place where standardization and systemization of processes are being done in PL, they will take some steps towards this. And I want to thank NAL because there is no other agency, lab, which has an ability to understand this domain at this moment, to integrate people working across various disciplines to come together and then discuss this and then create some baseline framework and also corresponding governmental policies as well at a later point in time and drive this to make it happen over a period of time. I think this workshop has different elements. The first and foremost is technologies and domains, which will vary. I think when you talk about aircrafts management, this also, historically it evolved over a period of time of various types of platforms. I think we have now globally certain standards in which aircraft are controlled, but possibly this is also not, when you talk about, today we discussed about the strategic component as well as the civilian component. We know that in aircrafts also there is differentiated, though there is an understanding that they are unified. So we need to understand this differentiated, unified concept in this as well. It will come because we can't unify everything. We need to keep them at certain distance away, but we need to find a way to unify. Those unification will happen in certain domains. It won't happen in certain other domains. I think this is very, very important to understand that and then apply. Again, on this unmanned vehicle, we call them unmanned aerial vehicles, but then slowly they are going to become manned as well. And we know that very, very clearly, that especially when we talk about drones being used for personal transport, and this is going to be a major game changer in the areas of unmanned vehicle now becoming manned vehicles. And then the question of personal safety regulation becomes much more stricter than those drones that are used for agriculture, disaster management, and many, many other, even for defense, it's not going to be manned at all. So they are of one class, and the one which will have people traveling will be of different class. I think you are aware of many people within the country developing such drones like scooters and cars, where people will be traveling for short distance holds, possibly from cities to airports and back and forth, typically 30 to 50 kilometers of journey. And this is going to be the one which need to be addressed at the very first instant, than all those vehicles which are going to be under the consideration of this regulation or governance. So this requires so much of attention at this moment because many of them are going to be a reality in a few months, I believe, maybe not be many years away, and that's very much visible in front of them. And many of the regulators, policymakers, technocrats will be faced with the challenge of how do we really start it. I think the starting is going to be very, very problematic, and I'm very sure about it. Possibly they may do some demonstrations, but then converting into an operational system where industries come and operators come, they will operate on a commercial basis, is simply going to be a huge challenge to start with itself. In next 1 or 2 years, we need to do that. So my request is that let us address that sector immediately and find a way by which we can actually start it. The second, then it will happen that when the human traveling drones come into action along with other platforms, we need to worry about the autonomous drones which are also going to occupy the same space, possibly becoming a threat to many of such transportation. So then we need to now look at creating another set of norms where the manned and unmanned vehicles coexist in the same airspace. And how do you really deal with that situation? Now here the next set of scaling up of the whole plans, we need to address it. Possibly this is little next second phase, and that also need to be addressed. And now we know, many of us know, I think all of you most probably know that this domain is very technology centric, and one of the important issue is communication, of course, than many other things which of course they need to be addressed, like safety, the corridor definitions, the people who are really going to manage, who are the one who need to know about it. I think many of these things will come in discussion. But the elements of technology that will enable us to do unified airspace management is the first thing. In that the communication becomes the key element. Defining standards and the participating entities become important. Of course, the vehicles themselves are the ones, but who are the other people who are going to be part of this? Let me discuss with you whether the terrestrial networks, possibly the towers that we know, will it be ever part of this whole network? The standard 5G, 6G networks which are going to be there around us, will they be the one which will become part of it, or something else that we will put? There will be a separate set of networks than the one which is currently handling mobile networks. The second question is whether you will put additional set of platforms like the one which will be floating above us and which will handle all of this, specifically designed for this, will be the one which we have to ensure that there are no clashes, there are no issues. Then the third layer, of course, is the spacecrafts, and how spacecrafts can really become part of this whole aircraft navigation, whether it is really technically feasible, reliable, and available, because availability becomes very important all the time. Whether this is going to be a technology which will enable us to do that way, looking at the operational time criticalities as well. Now, I coming from space sector, and we have been discussing, knowing about this threat or opportunity coming in space. Of course, we are all aware that space can do only three things. One, it can do communication backbone support. It can also do imaging. Of course, it can give the navigation timing support. So how do you really integrate this into a different set of satellites, or you really bring in a common system or architecture which this can be really enabled for a unified airspace management? And globally, this is also going through a huge amount of changes in the recent times. The communication is also changing. You know that it has been generally through geo platforms. Now we know the LEO platforms are taking over across the world. And now Starlink is also coming to India, and slowly you will see that you will have direct-to-device connectivity from low altitude and medium altitude orbiting satellites. You will have a direct mobile connectivity with not much of time-related issues coming up in the real-time communication. Now, when such a global presence of a communication network is present, which is more available and reliable, do we need to put anything else? So, whether it will be 100% based on space-based communication networks. The question of out of line of sight, because when aircrafts requires a line of sight communication capability, here the line of sight is not really going to be possible at all. And many a times that you will never be able to see that. You will only, you cannot track it from such places. So the type of technologies which are required, and how do you really identify objects which are flying, whether you need to use imaging technologies to identify and track, like object identification tracking through high resolution imaging, whether it requires to be done, this is another question. Whether you add another layer of safety into the identification so that you will be able to navigate just not based on communication alone or positioning it based on such signals alone. So this, whether we need to have multi-sensor fusion capability really to positively assure availability or position of any object flying. So this becomes a major issue. Then the issue like, for example, cities where the human beings are going to fly from some buildings to airport, for example. The corridors are to be defined. I think these are the corridors that we need to urgently define. And along the corridors, we need to make sure that it is fully visible, traceable throughout the journey from one place to another. In such a journey, whether we are going to create any separate architecture of communication networks through available mobile towers, or you are going to use some buildings, you are going to use some extra communication architecture along the path which are well defined, so that you are not allowed to deviate or you are not allowed to cross any such places. So this also calls for large scale investment in terms of infrastructure investment, and also roles and responsibilities of who the investors are, how you really take returns of it, and who are the custodians of all of this. This becomes another topic of discussion, whether it is a civilian authority or it is not just the regulators, I mean operators of this becomes important, and how do you really bring out the returns from this, and who are going to pay for it. All this becomes a commercial activity which also need to be addressed. Of course, in India, I think this is slowly growing, emerging, especially the unmanned aerial vehicle sector. I'm not going to the strategic and defense side, because I asked in the beginning, I said that this is going to be coexisting, working, but it has to be treated in a different manner. For example, as a Director Samir just mentioned, when you look at swarms and strategic cases, possibly all of these are likely to fail, and you may not be able to operate with that type of environment, and it has to be handled in a totally different architecture, I believe. But then it will become important issue for us in other domains. For example, disaster management. When you need to look at disaster, all of us know that drones are going to play more and more important roles in the days to come. For example, distribution of food, distribution of medicines, kits, scanning and understanding the situations around, and then reporting back. I think drones will become bigger role when they play, and there are a large number of drones need to be deployed, or crafts need to be deployed at that point in time. In such occasions, how do you really create local emergent basis networks? Possibly it won't be existing at that point in time before the disaster occurred, and we need to create in very short notice such conditions for somewhere. How do you really create such local regulation capability? For example, on a hill, generally nobody will be going, but then there is a need to go. So, but then still you need to operate at large drones. And this is another new case. How do we need to define? And can we really create a space-based networks at a local region using this is another interesting questions which need to be addressed. And there are another domain is called smart cities. I think smart cities again emerging. Smart cities again another concept where you look at large scale integration of IoT, communication networks, etc., where such vehicles will become an integral part of the smart cities. I believe the mobility will become an important issue. In smart cities, of course, it is possible to envision creating such infrastructure as integral part of this, and how do you right now itself bring policies or principles by which smart cities need to address this particular issue right at the beginning of discussion itself. Now what all things we need to do? I think today after the workshop, possibly some certain steps that we need to be taking, discussion need to happen on many things. I think that's what is meant out of a workshop, I believe. All those stakeholders should take action on some of these points, which I think it's very important. For example, the point I mentioned, which are the domains that we need to take up immediately, where certain actions can be taken. I believe it is where the human travel in such platforms are going to happen, especially at crowded cities where they are likely to be deployed on a commercial basis. And this requires very important actions in terms of identification of corridors, areas where it can be applied, and then create norms for it to operate, and then create infrastructure for it to operate. This is the first step. Second, of course, is any of such things requires test beds, simulators, certification processes. I think these steps will be taken definitely by NAL and other stakeholders in this, and that actions are now being taken by NAL, and this will become very important resource for people to come and then develop and then prove that this will really work. It is not possible to have with one test bed. I am sure about it. There are so many developers and so many operators, and we need to have multiple test beds and places in the country, across the country, for this to really scale up. Third is skilling. People are going to be very important. Who are the people who are going to operate it? What are the protocols that will come into place? Who are the knowledgeable people? And we need to first create courses, curricula of how do we really do that in this domain. And this again becomes an academic industry collaboration domain, skilling and developing people to handle it is going to be the third domain. Of course, as we discussed is technology domain, the part which will be done in terms of communication, in terms of safety. It's again going to be a very important issue for most of the vehicle going to operate here. How do you address the safety of many of these vehicles and certify it from the safety point of view? For example, in case of failure, what to do next in these vehicles becomes an important aspect. Where do you really go and land? How do you further navigate it in terms of autonomous systems fail and how manual interventions are done? This becomes a very serious issue to address in terms of such vehicles, because even with all of this, if there is a rogue activity, then you will be in trouble even with the Goodfellows working system. So technologies become important. Indigenization become important because many of this, the initial steps will always be based on somebody developed and purchased and installed. I think that should not be the way. I think the very beginning itself, we must make sure that the whole of the corresponding technologies, including software, protocols, hardware that will be deployed across the country, training, everything is actually based on techs developed within the country, and we need to insist and create principles by which it will be only remaining to be indigenous. And finally, customers, businesses. I think this also, anything that you want to do in this domain will be also linked with such activity, and it will never be possible from governments alone or institutions alone to drive it. We need to find out who are actually going to use it, who are actually going to fund it, where the money will come from. The business processes also should be discussed. And unless that is there will not be a huge amount of investment coming and creating infrastructure for it. That process is very important, and who is going to take leadership for it? This is again another topic. And finally, it's important that we need to connect people who will be creating this capability in research institutions and academics, etc. They will also should be part of this whole process, where they will work with all the stakeholders, policymakers to create the next steps. So I believe these are the few steps that we need to take beyond this workshop, and if you are able to identify and then take the next steps and expand this work in the coming years, I think we are in the right path. And thank you for this opportunity to come and speak here and see the good thing happening because of the collaboration of labs across CSIR and also other stakeholders in this discussion. Thank you so much.